Right, so we're going to do applying Aristotle's virtue ethics, and in the exam what you probably have is a question which begins with the word explain, and it might say something like, explain Aristotle's virtue ethics and how it is applied to an issue of your choice. So what you've got to do is you've got to think of an issue, and then in each and every paragraph what you've got to do is you've got to relate that issue back to Aristotle's virtue ethics. That's very important. Each paragraph must make reference to the issue and applying that back to Aristotle's virtue ethics. So the first paragraph obviously is going to be your introduction, and really for any applying virtue ethics essays, these three questions here are the questions that you need to ask yourself and show the examiner that you understand how you apply virtue ethics by using these three questions. And really these three questions make up your introduction. So the first one there, what does a virtuous person look like? And in our essay here, in this situation, we're going to be talking about what does a virtuous person look like according to Aristotle. And then we're going to be applying our issue to that question. Then we're going to be coming on to how do you become a virtuous person, and again, according to Aristotle, how do you become a virtuous person, and then we need to relate that back to our issue. And then finally, is the action in our issue, in our example, something that a virtuous person is likely to do? And by a virtuous person, what we mean is a virtuous person according to Aristotle. Now remember, virtue ethics does not ask whether a particular action is right or wrong. What it is asking is it likely that a virtuous person would carry out that action, and is that action something which shows you have virtues or will enable you to develop virtues? So coming on to our issue here, in our lessons we talked about applying virtue ethics to adultery, and in particular we thought about how if you can relate it to two different examples of adultery, you are able to really discuss the theory in a lot more detail. And so we discussed two adulterers. Adulterer A is 30 with a 6-month-old child and has been married for 2 years and cheats on his wife in a one-night stand. Now that's important because we need to think about what character does that show this person has, and is that character a virtuous character or not? Adulterer B is very different, and his adultery is done after discussing with his wife his need for his sexual needs to be met, but unfortunately his wife is unable to do that, and so he discusses it with her in order to keep his loving family together, and his, showing that he loves his wife and that he wants to stay together with her. So moving on to our first question, and so we're on kind of paragraph 3 now, we need to ask ourselves, what does a virtuous person look like for Aristotle? And then what we are able to do is to decide whether or not our adulterers are virtuous people. So obviously you are going to be discussing the 12 moral virtues which Aristotle comes up with. And in particular you might make reference to these three: justice, honesty and courage, because they apply quite nicely to the example of adultery. So what you would need to do, remember the question, explain Aristotle's virtue ethics. So what you are going to need to do is explain how Aristotle developed the 12 moral virtues, and you are using justice, honesty and courage as three examples of those virtues. But then what we need to do is apply our issue of adultery to those virtues. So what we would conclude really in this paragraph is that adulterer A does not have justice, honesty and courage, because if you remember back to what we said about adulterer A, he's cheating on his wife, he's got a child who, if their family breaks up, who's going to look after the child? Is that child going to have a good upbringing? All those kinds of things. And so therefore you need to ask yourself, is that person honest? Well, no, because he's cheating, going behind his wife's back. Is he just? Well, no, because a just thing to do would be not to break up his family and not put all the burden of looking after the child on the mother. And is he courageous? Well, again, no, because he's cheating on his wife. However, then what you could discuss is that adulterer B does show that he has these virtues, and so is virtuous. Does he have justice? Well, yes, because what he's doing is he's trying to keep his family together. Does he have honesty? Well, yes, he does, because he's discussed his problems with his wife, and they've come to a decision together, and so he's being honest. And does he have courage? Well, again, yes, because he's had the courage to discuss it with his wife. So then we're moving on to our fourth paragraph now, and we're talking about how do we actually become virtuous people according to Aristotle. And again, we need to link this back to our issue of adultery. For Aristotle, the way that we become virtuous people is by acting in line with the golden mean. And it's the virtues lie in between two vices, the vice of deficiency and the vice of excess. And so in each and every situation that you're in, you need to think, what is the golden mean here? What in each situation that you approach, you need to think, right, I don't want to act according to the vice of deficiency, I don't want to act according to the vice of excess. What would be the kind of middle way? What would be the middle ground here? And Aristotle says that when you do that, you use your phronesis. And the better your phronesis is, the easier you are able to work out what the golden mean is, and therefore act in a virtuous way. So again, if we link it back to our adulterers, adulterer A, you could possibly say, has a lack of phronesis because they're acting in line with the vices. So in their situation, they didn't think, right, well, I need to act in between the two vices here, I need to head for the middle ground. They didn't do that. They acted in line with vices. And for example, in this particular case, they acted dishonestly by lying to his wife, and so therefore acted in line with the vice of deficiency of honesty. However, if we look at adulterer B, you could say that he is using his phronesis and he is acting in line with the golden mean to work out what is the best course of action in his situation. And so he's thought about it and he's thought, right, well, I need to act honestly, so what's the honest thing to do here? Well, it's to, discuss it with my wife. I need to act justly and courageously. And so how do I do that? I need to discuss things with my wife, and so that's what he did. And so you could therefore say that in fact he is both developing and using his virtues in this situation by discussing it with his wife and committing adultery, having discussed it with his wife first. So following on from this, in the next paragraph, you're going to carry on talking about how we become virtuous, but you're going to relate it to what is the purpose of becoming virtuous, what's the point. And for Aristotle, becoming virtuous is all about reaching eudaimonia. Now, you're going to have to define this now. You can't use terms without defining. It's very important. You must explain fully by defining the term eudaimonia. And so, reaching eudaimonia for Aristotle is the ultimate goal in life, but it's not just a goal for us, for individuals, it's also for the community. And this is very, very important when we're thinking about whether or not adultery is something that a virtuous person is likely to do or not. So, acting virtuously helps the individual and the community to reach eudaimonia. And so you would need to explain that, and then you are going to relate that back to our issue. Now, adulterer A, you could say, is hindering both himself and his community from reaching eudaimonia because he's acting in an unvirtuous way. And what you could do is you could say that in this particular example, his particular community is his family. Now, obviously, you need to be talking about the community generally that he is in, but his kind of close community is his family. And so you need to ask yourself, well, is him committing adultery something that is likely to help or to hinder his local community, his family, reaching eudaimonia? And obviously, with his actions breaking up his family, you could say that that is going to hinder them reaching eudaimonia. If we move on to adulterer B, you could say that he is actually helping himself and his community to reach eudaimonia because he is being virtuous. And again, we could talk about his local community, which is his family, and you could say that his family is supported in reaching eudaimonia as his actions keep them together. So by him acting virtuously and discussing it with his wife, acting with courage and honesty, he's going to keep his family together and therefore helping all of them to reach eudaimonia. So finally, then you come on to your conclusion. Remember, we're not asking, is adultery right or wrong? We're asking, is adultery something a virtuous person would do? So what you could say then is that in the case of adultery A, that kind of adultery is not something a virtuous person would do because he's being dishonest, unjust and cowardly. However, in the case of adulterer B, you could say, well, actually, yes, adultery in that case is virtuous because he's being honest, just and courageous. So in conclusion, what we would say is that it is unlikely that a virtuous person would commit adultery, as it usually involves vices like dishonesty. However, as with adultery B, this is not always the case.